off in the first seminar. Just to remind those of you who were in the first one and for those of you who are joining us for the first time, these webinars are intended to enhance your understanding and expectations for the use of program evaluation. It's very clear that in a three-part webinar, we're not going to create new evaluators, but our hope is to give PIs more ideas about how they can creatively use program evaluation and integrate evaluation into current programs and future proposals. So this is all about expanding your capacity. It's about promoting ideas and sort of stimulating ideas for the infusion of evaluation into your work, and also to leave with you an understanding of the professional standards and expectations that one can and should have of evaluation, so that you are ensuring that you're getting what you can or should get from the evaluation work that you're commissioning. The course plan, I think, is a great idea in that I'm team teaching each of the webinars with someone who has an actual program. And so you have a slide in front of you that describes that we're going to talk about the evaluation content with a case, a project case, so that we can demonstrate the relevance and have a dialogue back and forth, hopefully to make this more engaging and also more relevant to your work. No one will leave this feeling like they know everything they need to know about evaluation, but hopefully you'll leave this feeling like some of the questions you might have had have been answered, and that certainly your thinking about the role evaluation might play has been stimulated. When you spend 2 to 5 to 7% of your program budget on an item, it ought to help promote what you're trying to accomplish, not just be an add-on at the end. And so the goal, overarching goal, the meta goal here is to see that evaluation becomes more prominent and more useful in the work that all of us are attempting to do. So with that, I'd like to introduce the co-presenter, Dr. Deborah Goldberg, and she will give you more of a background about herself as she introduces you to the M-STEM Academies.
Thank you, Melvin. It's really been a pleasure to be here and to be learning from you as we've prepared this. I've already learned a lot about evaluation as we've been preparing this, and I'm looking forward to learning more today as we talk about it. So we started the M-STEM Academies at the University of Michigan about 8 years ago, and then in 2012 I became very involved to extend a program in engineering into the liberal arts college, the sciences and mathematics in the liberal arts college at the University of Michigan. Our goals, and I should also introduce myself, I'm a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology. I'm a plant ecologist, so my initial knowledge of evaluation, program evaluation, was about 0. So let's go on to Melvin. Am I
see your mouse, but I don't see the slide advancing.
Okay, we practiced this.
Yeah, you do have it, so.
Okay. Oh dear.
Why don't I advance it for you? How about that?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just say next.
Try the down arrow.
Okay, yeah, I was. So the program goals are, as so many of the NSF-funded programs are, both to increase retention in STEM, as well as to increase the success of our participants so that they are more likely to be successful in a STEM career. Operationally, what that means for us is getting higher grades, and especially getting the experiences that matter, getting research experiences, having leadership positions, getting to know faculty, the things that really help for getting jobs and getting into graduate and professional school. We know it's more than just grades, so we want to get those experiences. Next. So the approach we took is modeled after a very well-known and very successful program called the Meyerhoff Scholars Program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Their main components are, it's a 4-year program with a very intense summer transition program, a boot camp, with very strong program values and very high expectations for academic achievement. There's intrusive advising and a very strong community. Building community is probably one of the calling cards of the Meyerhoff program, along with those high expectations and strong values. And we asked next slide, in our program, can the model of the Meyerhoff Scholars Program be extended to a large research-intensive public university? University of Michigan is rather elite, or some say elitist university. Many of our, I'd say the great majority of our undergraduates who are coming in are already, they're straight A students. In high school, they're used to being at the top of their class. They get a little bit of a rude awakening when they get to a university setting where everybody is like them. So unlike the Meyerhoff program, where they really recruit the very best students to come to be part of Meyerhoff at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, one important difference that is responsive to the culture of our university and the setting is that it's not an elite program, but it's also not a remedial program, and that's really important, and sometimes we have to talk to parents about that. Why should I send my student there? They don't need a remedial program, or they want only an elite program. We say this is for everybody at the university. This is not only for those who are way above the rest or below the rest. This is for everybody. Other important differences, unlike Meyerhoff, we do not have comprehensive scholarship support. That gives us some problems. So that's one of the questions we have. How essential is that? And we focus on the first 2 years of college, not all 4. Next slide. The program consists of, as with Meyerhoff, a summer transition program or a bridge program. We cover, we have an intensive curriculum in an integrative STEM course. They do math course, writing course. They learn the Michigan culture. We have very strict rules with a focus on accountability, as does Meyerhoff. We focus on meeting faculty, getting to know faculty. How do you talk to faculty? We do career pathways, workshops on academic and personal skills, from time management to studying, community service. And we have an incentive stipend based on our NSF STEP grant that allows us to give a stipend if they successfully complete the program. Next slide. During the academic year, we follow up with students who live, they live in the same dorm. They continue with academic coaching, again, an intrusive advising model. We monitor how they're doing in classes. We call them in if they're not doing well and say, how can we fix this? What can we do better? We require them to use many of the resources at the university, like peer-led study groups. We have tutoring for them. We require them to do research. We have monthly family meetings where we talk about issues and make sure that they are maintaining the strong community, and have other workshop skill development during those. Next slide. Our real goal here is that to integrate all the existing resources at Michigan, and again, this is the context of Michigan, is that we have many resources. We're very lucky to have a lot of things already set up, but students don't use them. Our goal is to make sure that all of the students in STEM academies use those resources so that we have an integrative whole, an integrated program. We also partner with academic departments where the students are going to major in biology or in physics or in math. Make sure that the faculty in those departments know about our program, they know our students, they get to know them during their first 2 years. So when they transition to majors and we're no longer directly involved, they have support, they have people who know them and who have begun to appreciate them as leaders, as students with really strong values about academic excellence and leadership. Okay, next slide. So who are the M-STEM students? Well, we end up with about 60 coming in each year. So we have fairly large cohorts, but that seems to work. We invite to apply all students in the College of Engineering or the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. That's a liberal arts college at Michigan. So they're admitted and they said in their application they were interested in science and or math, and they are from a demographic group that we know are statistically less likely to stay in STEM. So historically underrepresented minorities, first generation college, low income. And next slide. Our comparison group are those we invited to apply but chose not to. So this, of course, is one of the weaknesses that we always have, which is our comparison group, our participants are self-selected. So this has always been one of my big questions about our evaluation. How do we take into account that self-selection, that there may be a different level of motivation? For assessment, we have data, institutional data, that we can gather. We have surveys that we do of the students and of the comparison group, and we do that not only the first 2 years but all 4 years so that we can follow what they do even though we're no longer directly intervening. And we also do interviews with the MSci students to really talk about how they might be changing and affected by the program. Next slide. We're going to focus here on the institutional data, because our sample sizes for the other data are still relatively small. So as we hoped and would expect, our MSci scholars are indeed more diverse than the LSA students as a whole. I'm going to focus on the LSA program because the NSF STEP grant and our evaluation actually does focus primarily on that. Engineering is funded from other sources. So if we look at the first 2 bars, those are MSci and our comparison group, and you can see they're lower income, more first gen, more minority, slightly more women than the rest. They're also, if we look in the lower right corner they're slightly less well prepared, slightly lower composite ACT scores, but I also recognize that these are fairly high scores. So these are students who are quite capable overall. Next slide. So what are the outcomes? First, from institutional data, yes, our MSci scholars are indeed more likely to major in a STEM field. If we just do a group comparison between the MSci scholars and our comparison group, it's about 90% versus about 50%, of 45 to 50% overall. But we can do a second kind of comparison, next slide, where we can actually match individuals. Some of my colleagues here refer to this as learning analytics approaches. We match individuals on characteristics like their math ACT, their high school GPA, demographic things like family income, gender, ethnic group. And when we do this matching, we get
Deborah, sorry to interrupt you. I just have a really quick clarification question for you before we get too far. One of our attendees asked, what does LSA stand for?
Thank you. It's the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. It's a liberal arts college at Michigan. I had it real briefly in the first slide, and it's just one of those acronyms I am way too used to using, so thank you for asking. Okay, so I'm focusing on the liberal arts college effect.
Okay, Deborah?
Yes.
While we've interrupted you, let me drop in a comment, a suggestion that comes to mind for all of those listening. Often we are involved in a replication, either a full replication or partial replication, or just what might be called variations on a theme.
Yes.
So you've got multiple projects in different institutions attempting similar goals with similar strategies.
Right.
one of the things that I don't see often, in fact, I don't think I've ever seen it, is collaboration on the evaluation end of this.
Yes.
Imagine the value of having evaluators collaborate on the design of these studies, perhaps even purposefully building in a loose coalition as you do your project proposals, so that you do have the kind of meta-evaluation data and end up with larger sample sizes where you can do more creative work.
That is a great point. And in fact, there is a group of institutions that are funded by HHMI that are very explicitly doing a comparison with Meyerhoff. I think it involves North Carolina, Penn State, and one other institution I don't remember. And we were not part of that initial HHMI group, but we have met with them several times and are talking with them about trying to do more evaluation in common. So I agree, that's a really important point.
Good.
So, and we do consult with Meyerhoff pretty regularly. But we haven't yet, we're not using exactly the same surveys, and that is something that we've talked about, trying to get them more consistent.
Yeah.
And just to chime in with one more question from the audience that relates to this. So they were wondering if you use propensity score matching for the...
So I actually, let me ask Melvin what exactly the propensity score matching is, because that's a question I've had about evaluations. I wasn't sure if that is similar to what we call our learning analytics style matching, or is that something else?
Well, and that's one that stumps me as well. I don't use propensity score matching for a reason you'll hear later in my presentation. So that's a new one for me.
Okay.
Well, I'll look it up and we can maybe look at it later in the webinar.
Yeah, in fact, I would like to, I'll do that as a follow-up and then maybe post a comment or two on STEM Central.
Right. I mean, we do this.
Question about this particular topic. I know we should probably move on, but one question is, how do you get your control group to reply to the surveys?
Incentives, gift cards, lotteries.
Yeah. Also, from the first webinar, the University of Portland has creatively started doing their questionnaires in a required course.
Mm-hmm.
So you have an automatic way of having a comparison group that is the rest of the entire population.
Right.
All right, thanks.
And the trouble is we don't have any single course that all of our comparison group would take. So we haven't figured out a way to do that. We've talked about it, but it's a great idea, and we're working on it. So, okay, let's see. So again, this outcome on majors is, we're about doubling the majors, but I will go back to my concern. Are those participants, those who chose to participate, somewhat more committed initially? And we're trying to figure out ways of asking questions, other sorts of data to get at their initial commitment. Perhaps what courses do they register for their first semester, for example. Okay, next slide. We also have looked at grades, and this again is matched as an individual basis. So the data you see in the slide here are the differences between MSci and a matched individual, matched on these things here, with a non-MSci student. So if we look at GPA in the non-STEM courses, it's significantly higher both in the first term and by the third term. Interestingly, if we look at the GPA of the STEM courses only, it's actually lower for the MSci scholars, our participants in the first term, although it is quite a bit higher by the third term, which is what we were hoping for. So this really puzzled us, but it turns out that we are not completely confident, but we think it's because our students are more persistent. They don't drop out. They're getting some of that grit. They say, I'm going to stick it out, and they don't drop the courses when they start getting hard in their first semester, the way many first semester freshmen do, who get into calculus at college level and just say, I can't do this. So that actually does lower their grades, but you can see they stick it out and they do get higher as they proceed. Next slide. So these are just some preliminary ideas from our interviews. We really find that an awful lot of what's going on has to do with the other MSci scholars, that having other people taking that class too, we'll be able to study together for sure. That if you have doubts and you don't feel you have time to prepare for an exam or ask a professor, you just go to your MBio, that was our first name when it was just biology friends, and ask them. When you're in calculus, when you get to a problem, have you done that? How do you do this? They rely on each other. They have people who share their values, share their work ethic, and share their interests and their courses. And that seems to be a really, really important part of the success of the program. So if we go to the next slide. So these are the questions we've been asking, or that we think should be part of our evaluation. The first question is just, is the program effective in achieving the goals? Are we retaining students? Are they getting higher grades? Are they taking more leadership positions, etc.? And of the data I've shown you, we would say yes. They are staying in STEM more. They do have higher grades. We know from other data, yes, they seem to be doing more leadership work, taking more leadership roles. We don't have enough to get to the graduation rates yet, but we're getting close to having enough data there. But the second two important questions about our evaluation, we don't have a really good idea yet. That is, what are the mechanisms driving these changes? What are the attitudes, the perceptions, the behaviors, the things that are really individual student level, are we changing compared to our control students? We have survey data, but one of the issues is that we haven't really organized, been closely coordinated enough with our evaluators so that the reports we get on our survey data are organized in a way that we can actually answer this question. We get kind of each question and then an exhaustive set of what are all the answers, and then another question and what are the answers. We need to really think about how do we answer questions as opposed to just record lots of data from our evaluation. And the third thing that we haven't really addressed is what elements of the program are key to leading to those changes. This is a big program, it's an expensive program, it's got a lot of moving parts. Are all of the elements equally important? Could we, for example, not do some parts, and would we be almost or as effective? And because it would cost less, we could reach out to more students. So to me, that's a critical part of an evaluation, but it's also one that we haven't spent as much time in figuring out, working with evaluators, and how to answer that question. So those are some of the good big questions I have about our evaluation. How do we organize our data to make it more useful in understanding what's going on in this program, not just is it successful, but why, what's going on, what's making it work. So I'm going to turn it back to Melvin. And
Deborah, we'll pause now for some questions, but as we do, there are a couple of observations that, again, I'd like to make, sort of the big picture. One is many projects that we do are built on what has worked in other places, and Meyerhoff is a classic example of that.
Right.
It happens that Freeman Hrabowski, the president at UMBC, who's credited with the success of Meyerhoff in many ways, he and I were in graduate school together, so I've known him for a long time, 40 years.
Well, he's certainly one of my heroes.
And that is exactly the point.
Yeah.
When you have a program like Meyerhoff, how important is it that you have the original visionary who is able to take that seed and create a program that generates a lot of momentum? And then, so that's for when you're trying something totally new. But then when you want to come along and take the best of what Meyerhoff has developed, what is essential to export to Michigan? And that's part of your question.
That's part of my question, yeah.
Meta-evaluation question, because, again, if Michigan, I'll use an example from Ohio. There's a consortium of institutions in Ohio, in northern Ohio, that all applied for the same grant at the same time, created a consortium, and they're sharing information across those institutions. So it's going to be easier to see how personalities play out and play an important role. So one of the things I would put out for people in the audience is think about whether you're replicating in a similar setting, replicating in a whole new setting, or attempting to do something that is kind of a combination of things that have worked at several other institutions. And if so, how might an evaluation begin to get at what creates the momentum behind the program? Not directly resulting in outcomes, but creates the momentum that just allows you to sustain the program.
Yeah.
So we might now open it up to questions from the entire community here.
Yes, thank you, Melvin. And we do have some questions. One is from Milena Angelova. Sorry. Are the students in the treatment and control groups all first generation?
About 50% in each group. There's an earlier slide that shows the data. It's very similar. It's not statistically different, the percentages in the control comparison group and and the ones in the program, and it's much higher than the population as a whole for the college. It's about 50%, if I remember right.
Okay, thank you. And another question from Pamela Stegall. Currently, what method or program is used to capture information, for example, Excel spreadsheet?
To capture the data, we mine a lot of institutional data. So, and we actually have some fabulous people who are working on another NSF grant, one of the wider grants, who do the learning analytics, and they have helped us mine the data to extract what we need about the students. So frankly, I don't know if we're using Excel or we're using Access. My guess is Access, just because we have many different sources of data. We keep our program records are all kept in Excel spreadsheets because I know how to use that, and I'm not good with Access, and so I can get access to them. But the people who are doing our mining institutional data undoubtedly are using something more sophisticated than that.
Okay, thank you.
Which points to another really useful strategy. Even small institutions that have multiple sources of funding for broadening participation or student retention, having one office on campus that is the repository for all the data is extremely useful.
Yes.
In terms of being able to maximize what you get from the data and also cross-fertilizing, because you can have data from one program that informs decisions in a different program.
That's exactly right. And I might add in here that, you know, of course, one of the big questions for NSF grants is STEM transformation grants is it going to be institutionalized? What's going to happen at the end of the grant period? And our agreement with the university is that if we can show it's successful, that they are willing to continue it, but they also want to evaluate against other programs. They want to figure out what are the most successful, which is partly why we are using this central office that has been doing the learning analytics to look at all the different programs using the same sort of institutional data to look just at the simple outcomes. And again, the university is not as concerned about the mechanisms. They want to know where should they put their resources to get the best outcome. So we are doing a common analysis in terms of the simple numerical outcomes.
Okay, and I think I'm going to take one more question from before we move on with Melvin, so in interest of staying on schedule. But one more question from Milena is, what statistical methods were used to ensure that the findings are statistically significant?
That was just a pair for the matched ones. We used a pair t-test. It was really simple because it's relatively simple data. It's just a GPA, and we have matched individuals, so we can simply do a paired t-test. For the other one, I think, again, those were simple analyses, such as a regular t-test when we're doing the group comparisons. We haven't needed anything more complicated than that for our data so far. Now, when we get to some of the qualitative data, it gets more complicated. But we're still working on those analyses, so I'm not really, and I don't really have the full report from our evaluators to say what are they using on that one. So sorry, I can't get any deeper than that on it.
I will make a couple of comments, not specifically about that, but related to that, which may also raise more questions about the kinds of analysis. So we'll get to that in just a moment.
Okay.
Are we ready to move on, Tanya?
Yes, let's keep moving. And we love all the questions, but we also want to try to finish on time.
Okay. Let me introduce myself a little bit in terms of more importantly, some of the biases and perspective that I bring to program evaluation. Probably should establish my credentials by saying that I have an earned doctorate in measurement and evaluation, so split between psychometrics and program evaluation from the University of Illinois that I earned before most of you were born. I actually was a student in evaluation from 1973 to 1979 when I finished.
Melvin, you got nothing on me. We're good.
So I've been an evaluator for, as I say, over 40 years. And my experience in evaluation is with programs where what you're doing present data that are difficult to quantify. And so that's why I made the comment earlier about propensity scoring matching not being something that I use, but I'll explain in a minute how I get around that in terms of drawing that in when it's needed. The second source of my bias is I've been working with NSF now for probably 15 years in a number of different programs. I started doing panels and reviews in the program evaluation unit way back when they had one under Reese, and all the evolutions since then through the division on unsponsored learning and into the kind of programs that exist now. Right now, I'm mostly involved with the advanced program and with HBCU Up, as well as with some of their overarching committees that deal with program evaluation issues. So my experience in evaluation in the last third of my evaluation career has been heavily influenced by my work at NSF. One of the reasons I say that is because in many projects where there is a social science question, what is a classic social science research question, as Deborah started out, can a model like Meyerhoff be applied in an institution like Michigan? That, strictly speaking, is not an evaluation question.
No.
It's an applied research question.
Exactly.
And so what Advance, as one example, has done is, in fact, they now require in their institutional transformation grants that you design a social science study that deals with some aspect of institutional transformation, and that you get funded to do a legitimate study that meets all of the rigors of social science research.
Right.
The big difference between social science research, applied research, and evaluation is the issue of generalizability. In research, you want your findings to be something that will inform others around the world or around the discipline. In program evaluation, in terms of spending your resources, you're much more focused on the here and now and the particulars, the specifics of that particular instance, because it will never be actually replicated. Only a variation of it could ever be replicated. And so the questions and the strategies that one uses are somewhat different, or should be somewhat different, I argue, in program evaluation and applied research. I'll bet, I should have made this a polling question, that many of you who have evaluators have people who are doing social science research projects as an evaluation. And the difference is, in evaluation, you should understand the whys of the outcomes at the end, as opposed to just understanding the outcomes. In research, the outcomes are really what you're after. So I'll say perhaps more about that as we go along. But first, my evaluation cycle slide. So I can demonstrate that in the first webinar, we went through the first parts of how one organizes to do an evaluation. And now we're going to talk about developing the evaluation plan, the issues in the data collection process, and field testing data and data collection. So the Michigan illustration or case provides some rich possibilities in terms of thinking about what one can and perhaps should do with respect to the evaluation design. So I like this definition and the term methodology. This will reveal more of my bias. Many evaluators have a preferred method, and I use the word method clearly to say how you collect data. Methodology is the whole design process, which gets you into thinking about the questions and the knowledge that you need and what epistemologically is required in order to address what your goals are. Method is so much smaller than methodology, but many people get hooked on a particular method that they begin to worship it as sort of, here's how I do evaluation. Pre and post test, quasi-experimental designs, whatever their particular stake might be. Appreciative evaluation or appreciative inquiry, participatory, developmental, the labels continue to come. So I argue that the evaluation, number one, should not be an off-the-shelf a priori design, and that anyone who approaches you and says, without looking at your project, here's how I do evaluation, you probably don't want as an evaluator. So here's a question. Has anyone, or perhaps you yourself, used the method of data collection to defend or challenge the outcomes or inferences of a study? Someone doesn't like the results, and so you then say, well, here's how the data was collected as a way of responding to concerns about the results. And so I'll keep talking while you register your responses, and then we'll come back and take a look at that. Evaluation should be informative, timely, accurate, relevant, credible, and responsive to program theory. Responsive to program theory, which is to say, you have a reason for doing what you're doing and a reason for believing that it might work. Your evaluation has to align with the reason you think your intervention is going to work. My tried and true analogy is baking the turkey. I shouldn't say baking, cooking the Thanksgiving turkey. We have Thanksgiving coming up soon. If you have an approach or a recipe to cooking that turkey, and you try to pick it up and use it to bake or cook a duck, it is going to not provide the same results, even if you religiously follow that recipe. So I argue that evaluation has to be designed and tweaked around the program theory for that particular program, which means it should always be custom designed. So Tanya, do we have poll results?
Yep, you should be seeing them now. If you can't, then I can read them off to you. We had 65% reply yes, 12% said no, and 23% were not sure if they've heard someone use a method of data collection to defend or challenge outcomes or inferences of a study. So quite a few.
That certainly matches with my experience, that most often the first line of defense for outcomes and recommendations is to go back to the method. And if you think about the turkey analogy, the method could be religiously and scrupulously implemented and still be wrong.
Right. Just not collecting the right data for answering your question. You're not. Is that the kind of thing you mean?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Another wonderful cocktail term is misplaced precision.
Yes.
A lot of our strategies in evaluation are very precise, but the precision is in the implementation, not in matching the overarching theme and the overarching question.
Right.
So moving right along, it's important for evaluation then to match the logic model or the theory of change. And if it does, it also keeps the project and the evaluation on track because you're all heading in the same direction. I like to think that my students understand the material better after the exam than even before, because the exam should be a learning experience.
Right.
An exam that only documents what they already know without promoting learning is really not a good use of their time.
Right.
Same applies for evaluation. You should learn through the process of evaluating your project. And that's what this logic link model suggests. And all of this revolves around the cultures and cultural context of your project. So let's quickly take a look at Michigan. Under cultures, Deborah mentioned that Michigan has a self-image, and that students who come to Michigan have a self-image. That's why they come to Michigan.
Right.
So an evaluation that doesn't take into account the culture of the institution and the expectations that students have and that the institution has is not fully looking at the theory of change in context.
Right.
The students that are involved in Deborah's program are from previously underrepresented or currently underrepresented populations and from populations that are not even well represented in the higher education community. Their cultural background and experiences also are critical to the way they're receiving this intervention. And so all of those things are important parts of matching the evaluation design and maximizing the information that comes from the evaluation.
So, Melvin, when you, if you would think about what we've done, you may not be able to answer this, but what we've done so far in our evaluation, are there things that you might think about where we haven't taken that into account enough, or suggestions for how we might do a better job of taking that context into account, or is that just something we haven't talked about enough yet to really get to?
Well, actually, I'm always full of ideas, and
we need
them. Suggestions I would make is in your qualitative data analysis, and especially in terms of the matched pairs.
Yep.
If you could involve the people that you've had as matches in a focus group, one of the critical questions is, to what extent is the comparison that we're making a legitimate comparison? You have selected your students and invited them to apply from certain characteristics, first generation, lower income, and so forth, and you have matched them on the same criteria with other students who have those similar features. The question is, are those the relevant features?
Well, right. It's a good...
So by doing some kind of follow-up with your matched group, you're in a position to say, yeah, they're matched on those criteria, but do we really have a group that we should consider a comparison group?
Right.
So just one, that's just one.
Right. Now,
Because
how we do that...
Experientially, they might be quite different.
Right. And how we capture the relevant... one, how do we figure out what those are? But the other thing, and part of why we use these criteria, is because they're ones we can capture with the data we have available. And what you're saying is just because you can capture the data doesn't mean it's relevant data, is your point.
Yeah, and the other nice thing about your example is it's illustrative of the difference between a retention model where an institution looks at the data and information it has and says, how can we use this to improve the chances of retaining students, versus starting with the student and asking them what's important to you to accomplish and what's relevant to accomplishing those things, in which case your comparison group might look different. If you were able to interview the students in your program and say, tell me about yourself, and use their autobiographical information to match them with other students, they might be quite different.
They might be. I'm thinking how to do that. Yeah, at scale.
Another way to about this is NSF, when it has insight into some of these kinds of quirky features that may be relevant, often write special review criteria into the solicitation. So as the slide on the screen now indicates, an important thing to think about in evaluation is, does my evaluation respond to the special review criteria? Perhaps first, does it respond to the classic merit review process of intellectual merit and broadening participation? Because as a reviewer, I always look to the evaluation to not just match what the program said it's going to do, but to match the outcomes, which are always described in terms of intellectual merit and broadening participation. I can't remember finding an evaluation that really spoke to that explicitly, yet it's pretty clear that it should, because in the final analysis, what are you promising for the money that NSF invests? You're promising intellectual merit and broadening participation. Your evaluation should help you make the claim at the end of your project. And then to also respond, Deborah, to one of your earlier questions about how do we get the evaluation organized, the data organized in a way that makes sense to us. This, I was nodding at the time because it's a perpetual problem. And I have what I think is a relatively straightforward and simple, it's not a solution, but it's a heuristic to help people think through this issue. You have issues or major questions that you're attempting to address in your evaluation. And those issues correspond to your theory of change and your logic model and what you're promising your funding agency that you're going to do. You also have resources for gathering information on how well you're doing. Participants, faculty and staff, non-participants, and so forth. There might be a dozen sources of data, and you may have, I try to keep it to 8 issues or less. Usually you can nest smaller issues on the larger ones. But if you take this kind of strategy with your evaluator, then what they can do is look at what respondents can help me address each of these issues. And within this cell, the participants might be doing focus groups, responding to surveys, there might be direct classroom observation. Any number of methods of data collection might be used to fill in this bucket. And then when they do it with non-participants addressing the same issue, across this data collection, you have notes on the first issue. So it's
Right.
organized for you in terms of what you care about.
Right.
You don't know the details on every item it was asked.
So what might be, just as an example, and what might you take, if you were doing an evaluation like of a program, what might be some of the issues that you would organize this by?
One of the issues that's inherent in your program is how the intervention is perceived by students and their parents, whether they see it as remedial, and whether that's a turn-off to participating. Since you're using volunteers, that's particularly important. So for future years, the word on the street about your program will dictate whether people volunteer.
Right.
So this would be one issue that would directly impact how you market the program and the kind of atmosphere that you create in your intervention. So that would be an issue that would be important for you to understand and to track.
And that's really good, because it's one we think about, but we never thought of it as part of the evaluation. So it's treated as something
that's often thought of as an administrative issue.
Absolutely right, and you're absolutely right. It should be, and we should have thought of it there. So that's a great point. Thank you.
And so what this kind of chart also does is, when you look at the bottom of the column, have I maximized what I can get in terms of information from participants? So that might have triggered your thinking of, well, what do participants view? How do they view this whole thing? So it's another way, another heuristic, a way of picking up and embellishing your thoughts about what you're able to get from evaluation.
So this is Tanya chiming in. I just want to play the role of timekeeper. I know this is a wonderful conversation. Very excited to hear all the engaging dialogue, but we have about 5 more minutes before we're officially supposed to end the presentation. So keep that in mind as you proceed to the next slide.
I'll try to take 3.
And I'll try to keep my mouth shut here.
So this is the chart that some of you are familiar with. It's my attempt to help us understand better, from the participant's perspective, what it is we are doing with them. We tend to view everything from the perspective of our intervention, not realizing that our participants had long lives before they got to us. So their culture of origin, their long ago experiences, and things that happened more recently are all factors in how they view what we're doing. So quickly, if you have 40 participants, you got 40 different historical trajectories. You've also got 40 different sets of concurrent issues that they're facing, and 40 different views of what your intervention is. You think your intervention's 5 things, it's probably 200 things, because the lens that each person brings will cause them to look at that as a variation on the theme you intend, not everyone seeing it exactly the same, which suggests that your outcomes also are going to be differentiated, and what's really going on in your intervention is similarly differentiated. And so all of that is intended to suggest a far more interactive, far more comprehensive role for evaluation in the things that you are attempting to do. So let's see if we can get a couple more questions answered before we run out of time.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, first I would just like to read a comment here from Maria Sanisteban. Very sorry for butchering people's names. But she cites that she totally agrees with the point that Melvin is making about implementation, knowing the differences between the institution. And I'm just saying, reading from here, she says, I think one element that is very transposable, and it seems to be key at many different institutions of many kinds with various demographics, is tech support network. Even Deborah, who admitted that they are all still trying to analyze why the programs are successful, has definitely identified that element as crucial. Would you say that is one of the most crucial, most important aspects? So tech support network.
I think that that is very important, and I'll use this way of formalizing it everything we do in data collection operationalizes the variables and the constructs that we're interested in. And to the extent that our technology impacts how we are able to operationally do things, and our ability to measure or to survey them restricts how we can define them, then what we're evaluating is never what we set out to do. We're evaluating a smaller, more crunched up version of that that's somewhat inhibited by our technology and our ability to measure.
Yeah, and also that's a great, I just want to also chime in that there's a clarification from Maria. She actually meant the support network, sorry. So just the support network as a whole, not necessarily specific technology, but just having a support network seems really critical.
Which is very much part of the culture of the institution. When Deborah said at Michigan they have a lot of resources, that means a support network that's very different than another much smaller institution.
But one of the things about having all these resources there is that the students don't use it. And so part of what we're trying to create in the program is a culture of using that and not being afraid to ask for help by using it. And your friends are using it as well. And so part of the network is, oh, my friend's doing it, I guess it's okay if I do it as well as they're just talking to each other. So I don't have the experience with a lot of different kind of programs, but when I talk to people, when I go to meetings of the other STEP grantees or the other meetings, it comes up again and again as really critical.
But that's a perfect example of when I mentioned if you have 40 participants, there are 40 different experiences going through your program. Part of that is each individual student, based upon what they've experienced before, will react to what you're offering or what resources are available. So it's not just the reality of the resources being there, but how those resources are viewed by the students.
Right.
Even there was a wonderful experiment about 20 years ago at Berkeley, study groups. An African-American professor interviewed his students about their use of study groups and how they chose who to do a study group with.
Right.
The African-American students did affinity selection. They picked people they were comfortable with. The Asian-American students tended to pick those they perceived as being the leaders in the class. So the way that you choose your study group partners, you're talking about the same mechanism, but students looking at implementing that mechanism very differently. So a course that requires a study group might have very different outcomes based upon the way the student's culture interacts with their choice.
Right. Well, I think that's a wonderful point to wrap up the on-time portion of the webinar. You've covered a lot of wonderful discussion points and answered most of people's questions here. The questions are still flowing in, but I'm also cognizant that it is now 1 after the hour, and so I promise that we will address all your questions on STEM Central. We'll have Melvin and Deborah write some written responses, and we'll post them at that group that I showed you on STEM Central in the chat box, and I'll email it to all you guys. And so I just like to take this moment to thank you with the closing poll. I'm going to open up this final poll to close with, so we can get your feedback on that, and then also just thank Melvin and Deborah so much for their time in participating in this webinar and sharing their expertise and their experience and questions. I really enjoyed the conversation. So we're just going to go ahead and wrap up now. For those of you who need to leave, rest assured that the questions will be answered on STEM Central. However, I also welcome those of you who would like maybe to stay for 5 more minutes, because I know it's not fair to stay too much longer, but I'm receiving some comments from people that they would like to stay a little bit longer. I'm going to invite people to stay just for a few more minutes if you would like to.
That's great.
So I'm going to close the, we still have lots of people voting for the poll, so we'll keep it open, but please, you can find all of the information that you learned today on STEM Central. The recording of the webinar will be in that working group. I encourage you all to join STEM Central and participate in the many discussions and access the resources there, and join us also for our following webinar. So Melvin, Deborah, any closing thoughts?
I'm delighted to stay, get a few more questions, but I want to thank Melvin for answering my questions about evaluation. So thank you.
I think that one of the reasons I enjoy evaluation is because, using a sports analogy, it's like open field running.
Yeah,
it's the opportunity to be an inquirer creatively.
Mm-hmm.
Because the real challenge in evaluation is doing it in a way that promotes what's being evaluated, not just adding on a layer. And I do have one comment that comes to mind, and that is my dissertation, which I did 40 years ago. One of the most important findings was that the anticipation of evaluation can and should be one of the most impactful parts of the evaluation. And this is what the accreditation model has as a strength. You know the criteria you're going to be evaluated on. It impacts your performance every year, every day, all the way up until the time you do your self-study.
Right.
So in the evaluations of your projects, think about how you can build in to the way you run your project a way of reminding yourself about the evaluation and having it impact your performance on a day-to-day basis, like the portfolio approach we talked about at the end of the first webinar.
Yep.
Well, let's just take one more question here. As long as people are sticking with us, I don't see the attendee list dropping that quickly, so there's still people here.
Okay.
One question is from Wailila Burgess. Current NSF proposals and EHR at least have sections for research plan and external review plan. Any guidance on how to adequately describe both research and evaluation process across those two such sections? It seems many PIs confuse research and evaluation.
Yes. The first is interview your evaluator very carefully in terms of making sure you have someone who understands evaluation. You understand the discipline, and so often on the peer review panel, I see evaluators written into grants that are people from the discipline. Well, you already have the discipline knowledge. Focus on people who have the evaluation expertise. Involve them early. Involve them when you're writing the proposal so that the evaluability, the opportunity to evaluate your program is built in right from the beginning. And then give job descriptions to your internal, external, and advisory board people. That's the way to maximize what you get. So when you have an external advisory board, select them because they have expertise in a particular portion of what you're trying to do, and let them know that that's what you want guidance from them on, and organize their meetings purposefully so they're not just giving you blanket feel-good responses as you convene them. And then second, if the evaluation is designed around the merit review criteria and the special criteria, using a strategy of linking those criteria to the resources that can address them, I think that will knit everything together and produce the kind of results that will really be useful.
So if we have time for me to ask one more question related to this?
Yep, let's have one more question, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up, and we'll answer the rest online. Thanks, Deborah. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm just, because I'm still on a, I know what a research question is for a biology grant, but so our research question for our NSF STEP grant was kind of this: is the Meyerhoff model, which consists of all of these things, applicable to a research-intensive public institution? That was kind of the research question, separate from, is our program effective in retaining students and increasing their experiences? So that's the distinction there. But the research, but it's very hard for the, I think the important point that Melvin's partly getting at there is that as a biologist, I want to get more students from different groups engaged in biology, but I don't know what the important research questions are about retaining students in STEM. That's where you want to get your evaluator to, because they're the ones, or the researchers from an education or a sociology or a psychology department, they're the ones who know what the relevant research questions are, and getting them engaged right at the beginning is a really critical thing. Right. They should know what the research questions are. That's not my expertise.
Yeah.
My goal,
the goal about it.
Yeah.
The theory of change is the big picture. How do we think the world works? The logic model is, in this program, we're taking that theory of change and applying it in a particular way to a particular objective. Research questions should answer the, are we correct in this theory of change and logic model? So research questions should tackle the application of the logic model in this setting and reaffirm, in terms of what the field learns as a result of that social science research, the field should learn about the strength of that logic model and how it was applied. So that's where the research questions come from.
Great.
Thank you. I sent out a text to the audience and I said, does anybody want to keep going? And a couple people said yes. So let's just do one more question, because I think everyone's really enjoying this conversation, and I think one more question might be okay. So this one comes from Maria Sandesteban. How forceful are you with interventions or intrusive advising? Asking students to do research for given amounts of time, for example. Other enriching activities like attending talks, site visits, etc. STEM scholarship grant specifies that these should be mandatory.
They shouldn't be mandatory. Yeah.
I have a wonderful little anecdote on the intrusive advising. This past fall, I did 8 site visits to historically black colleges and universities for the HBCU UP program. And when I was at Tennessee State, I was being toured around the campus, and they've converted their old library to a learning support center. And the young man that was taking me around described how they use it. And I said, oh, in the literature, that's called intrusive advising. And his response was, that's just the way we are. That's just the way we do things here. Mm-hmm. And what he was describing was faculty stopping students as they stroll across the campus and saying, are you going to class? So what the literature calls intrusive advising, in some cultures, is called caring. So the point I want to make is that when NSF puts those kinds of requirements or expectations in, the interpretation of how you do that in your academic environment is critical.
Right.
Because relatively speaking, at Tennessee State, if they were to do what the literature calls intrusive advising, which is requiring someone to come to the office so many times during the semester, they're actually taking a step back from the active advising that is already integrated into that culture.
Well, we might be using a different definition of intrusive advising. We're monitoring their performance in class. We don't wait for them to come for us. We reach out. We can't require them to come, but we will reach out, but we keep an eye and say, you should come. And then we let them know that we think they need some help, and we want them to come in. A little different. But if the question is how, I actually have a little issue with that S-STEM requirement. We did require research experiences, and we said that in an S-STEM proposal separate from this is funded by a STEP grant, but we also had an S-STEM grant. And we got dinged on it because we required research, even though we know research experiences can be really helpful in retaining students. And so the reason that NSF says, S-STEM says you can't do it is because students might not be able to afford to do it. Well, we have an option that takes care of that. We pay them to do research. So, you know, we tried to get around that, but I find it a kind of rigid rule. But we don't have S-STEM money anymore, so we can still require it, as far as I know.
Okay, so thank you. There's one more question that let's go ahead and close with. I think it's a good closing question. It says, could we have suggestions of where to look for evaluators and social science research consultants? So as a next step, everyone's going to run off and work on their evaluation strategy, and would like to know where they can get some help for evaluators and social science research consultants.
One quick source is the American Evaluation Association. And I should, for transparency, I should admit that I'm a board member of American Evaluation Association. But it is the largest association dedicated to program evaluation in the country. It has a topical interest group on STEM evaluation. It also has on its website a directory of evaluators who self-listed, so you can search for evaluators in your area of interest, in your geographic area, and so forth. I strongly encourage you to go to the STEM TIG, Topical Interest Group webpage, and all of this can be found off of the American Evaluation Association website. They also have a link for places where you can get information about instruments that have been developed, survey questions, even reports from other previous NSF-funded projects. NSF has funded an online evaluation library, an OERL, Online Evaluation Resource Library, where you can go and, again, get specific examples of things that have been developed for other NSF projects. So I think that's a good starting place, and the organization's made an attempt to identify other places like Centers for Disease Control and foundations that have a wealth of toolkits and other kinds of things that might be useful.
Great. All right, so everyone go out there and start having culturally responsive evaluation strategies. Thank you so much, Deborah and Melvin. This has been
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for everyone's questions.
Yes, my pleasure.
And we'll see you all on STEM Central.
Okay, bye.
Bye. We're recording. Goodbye.
Right.